This video is brought to you by Squarespace. At the peak of the Cold War, Reagan decided to raise the bar and finally make mutually assured destruction, or what he called a mutually assured suicide pact, obsolete. And to do that, he would use a number of new technologies to strike first, strike hard, and strike a decisive blow to the Soviet Union in case of all-out war. And this ace up his sleeve would be the new stealth aircraft. Well, kind of, because it turns out that technology wouldn't be ready for at least another 10 years. McDonnell Douglas came up with a solution to bridge the gap of a deep strike platform that didn't need deliberate fighter support. A do-it-all aircraft based on the best fighter America had at that point, the F-15. But the Soviets knew this, and their own doctrine for future warfare was changing as well. Spearheaded by Marshal Garkov, this new counter-strategy asked for precise weaponry, a smaller strike force with technological advantages. So they took their best fighter of the era, the infamous Su-34 flanker, to build their own answer to the Strike Eagle. Tactical ballistic missiles were a game changer in the 1980s for both sides of the Cold War, so much so that finding a way to eliminate them would turn the tide of war. MGM-52 Lance and Tochka missiles, followed by Oka missiles, were the main threat in case of either a nuclear or conventional war in Europe, because they could strike far from the front line, do so precisely, and there was no guaranteed way to shoot them down. Naturally, the Americans needed a way to counter this threat, and the F-15 Strike Eagle entered the fray. But the threat of air defense systems significantly evolved as well, because these systems kept being developed at an alarming rate, and aircraft were now less effective with each day. Again, there was a silver bullet called stealth technology, but it was far from maturity at the time because the F-117 was still in its infancy and wasn't combat proven. The B-2 was yet another black project that nobody knew it existed, and the F-22 was just a concept of a future air vehicle. So instead, the idea was to have a strike fighter able to penetrate deep into the enemy territory in small groups without air cover and seek and destroy enemy air defenses, or to strike down valuable known targets before the main attack. It was basically the role that stealth aircraft would inherit into the future, all while being cheap, or more precisely, based on something already in service rather than dumping billions of dollars of taxpayers' money into yet another new program. The F-15E ticked all of the boxes and was more than capable to perform these kind of missions. But the Soviets still didn't have a solution like this, even conceptually. Let's flip the tables and look at the other side. The Su-24 was a tactical bomber equivalent of the US F-111 Aardvark, and although fighters like the Su-27 and MiG-29 could carry air-to-ground weaponry, it was mostly limited to dumb bombs or unguided missiles. Not to mention that the Su-24 would have no chance in air-to-air combat against F-15s or the F-16. Thus, in 1983, while Strike Eagle was still in development, Pavel Katarkov, the commander of the Soviet Air Force, urged the Ministry of Defense to start developing a new strike fighter to match the Americans. Naturally, the Sukhoi Bureau, along with Rohan Martirosov as the chief designer, got the task from the Soviet government to develop their own version of the Strike Eagle. I love the fact that this aircraft looks like a Su-27, but it has two seats in the cockpit sitting right next to each other, one for you and your buddy. It's such a brilliant solution to the problem that they faced when building the aircraft, and it shows intelligence on behalf of the engineers. And you know who else has intelligence these days? Squarespace, with their new design intelligence. That's right, the amazing Squarespace website creator has combined 2 decades of industry-leading design expertise with cutting-edge AI technology to give you your strongest creative potential yet. Squarespace will actually recommend a fantastic design to reach your goals, a more beautiful, more personalized website, crafting a bespoke digital identity for your brand, and it will never look like a template again. So the game has finally changed. But building a website is only the beginning on Squarespace because you can also run email campaigns, get more customers, and even launch courses. That's right, if you want to teach something, Squarespace is now your one-stop shop for your entire educational portal. So head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to www.squarespace.com/found to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Now remember, when you click that link, you're supporting the channel and allowing us to make the videos just like this. So if you want to give me a Christmas present, click that link. While the Cold War was brewing up hot again, the requirements set before the Su-34 and Martirosov were as follows. This new aircraft would need to have a large combat radius, a high payload capacity, capable of carrying nuclear warheads, had the capability of air combat against the latest NATO jets in both BVR and a dogfight, and also the ability to refuel in air-to-air, and had the capability to fly both day and night missions, as well as any type of weather. That's quite the wish list, and when you actually start to think about it, it's kind of insane. A lot of the requirements were conflicting and cancelled each other out, because if you want to carry a lot, you have to have a smaller range, and if you want to be agile in combat, you can't carry a lot, and if you want to strike ground targets effectively, you need WSO, and the list goes on. Development started with a single Su-27UB trainer variant of the flanker as a base for this new project. This new aircraft got the designation Su-27IB, short for, well, I'm not going to try and pronounce that, but it translates to fighter bomber in English. One of the first changes that the engineers made was to have the pilot and weapons systems officer sitting next to each other like on board the Su-24. This was chosen because it was easier to communicate and performed well in combat. Then, for the rest of the aircraft, the Su-27 was ideal because of its range and payload capacity, as well as being the most technologically advanced fighter in the Soviet Union at the time. So the front section of the Su-27UB fuselage was completely reworked with a much wider and taller fuselage section to accommodate this new seating configuration, as well as give additional fuel and electronics, giving the new aircraft its very unique look. This large cockpit also allowed the pilot to have a first-class experience, at least in military terms, by standing up in flight and being able to stretch a bit, and even have a snack in the back of the cockpit. And even more considered in luxury, there was even a small container for going number one if the flight was too long. But let's not get too excited because Ryanair's going to get some ideas. Entering and exiting this cockpit was quite interesting as well. Instead of a canopy opening up, the crew would use ladders in a forward landing gear bay to enter the aircraft from underneath. Of course, they would still have ejection seats, and the canopy would blow off with explosives in case of emergency, and the cockpit itself was armored with titanium plates to protect the crew from ground fire. On the outside, the new aircraft, now under the designation T-10V, would also get canards, to keep that maneuverability requirement checked in case of a dogfight or invading missiles. And it was powered by new engines with 10% more thrust compared to its father, the Su-27. But with the ousting of Marshal Okokov and the untimely death of Dmitry Ustinov, there was a change in the political and economical climate of the USSR. The project would stall, and while Strike Eagle entered service, the T-10V was just in its early development stages. However, despite all the setbacks, in 1990 the first prototype finally performed its first flight successfully, and the Soviets made an interesting play to confuse the Western analysts about the purpose of this new jet. You see, there was another similar looking plane in development at the time, the Su-27KUB, a proposed naval version of the Su-27 for the Soviet Union's new supercarrier. So these crafty Soviets started doing simulated landings on this carrier with the T-10V, and the newspaper agency TASS would actually leak the picture on purpose. This plot worked, and analysts gave the designation Su-27KU, KU being short for the naval trainer for this new aircraft, so the real purpose of this jet was kept hidden, and it looks like the Soviet Union finally got the upper hand on those dastardly capitalists. Well, for a few months, until their entire system collapsed. After the Soviet Union fell apart, only 2 large aircraft development programs would keep its funding. The MFI, the Future Generation Air Dominance Fighter, and our hero of the story, the T-10V. In 1992, the new Su-34 was shown to the public at the Max Air Show, revealing the true purpose of its aircraft. And in 1993, a new prototype appeared with a polished design and some upgrades. The landing gear was strengthened and doubled to accommodate the significant increase in weight compared to the base Su-27. Vertical stabilizers were modified, and a large stinger was added between the engines to accommodate for a rear-facing radar as part of the development of the new K-74 short-range missiles. The Soviets found this concept of rear-facing radar and missiles quite fascinating in the 1990s, and that's why the Su-37 technological demonstrator was exploring this option as well. But in the end, the idea fell through, and even though the Su-34 kept this large and easily recognizable stinger or tail boom throughout the years, it's used nowadays to house the APU, the Auxiliary Power Unit. The program kept developing at a steady pace, and then we got to 1994 with a final variant called the T-10V5. This would finally be the version that would enter pre-production and go through state tests to enter serial production. Electronics and radar were now ready and mounted onto this new prototype, namely the PISA V004 radar, which would not only have an interesting elliptical shape due to the nose design, but also have an excellent range for the era of 200 kilometers. On the bottom of the fuselage, there would be an integrated targeting system called the Platan that would comprise IRST, laser designators, and a rangefinder, as well as a day channel. This is pretty much the equivalent of the EOTS on the F-35 today, which is quite impressive considering the era we're talking about, and because it also eliminates the need for targeting and recon containers. But then this project, as well as the whole of Russia, just stopped for a decade, and it would take almost 20 years for the Su-34 to finally enter serial production. Flash forward to 2008, and the Su-34 finally saw its first combat deployment during the Russo-Georgian War, and it performed great. Its primary role was to be used as an electronics warfare platform in SEAD missions, and it had success against Georgian air defense systems. It was after this war that Russia started seriously rearming and completing all of those prospective programs from the 80s. Give me a drum roll, please. The Kar-52, the Mi-28, the Su-35, etc. And so in 2012, the Su-34 finally entered serial production to be used by the Russian Air Force. The key issue that we have here is that we're talking about an aircraft designed in the 1980s, developed in the 90s, ending serial production in, hold on, let me check my notes, 2012? Now, development of the F-22 Raptor could be compared to the Su-34 because it was also initially designed in the 1980s, with the prototypes developed during the 90s and entered service in 2005. But this was a next-gen stealth aircraft, while the Su-34 was just a new aircraft type based on a 4th-generation fighter. Meanwhile, the F-15 Strike Eagle had 3 massive combat deployments so far, namely in Iraq during Operation Desert Storm, over Yugoslavia in 1999, and then back again in Iraq in 2003. It was upgraded with JDAMs and even an AESA radar and electronics update in early 2010. So by the time the Su-34 entered serial production, it was already obsolete because it was some 25 years late to the party, and there was also another lingering issue. It was an aircraft designed to use precision-guided weaponry, which Russia was lacking. Now, if it had entered service in the late 1980s like the Strike Eagle, it would be one hell of a formidable strike fighter, in many aspects even better than its American counterpart. Which brings us to the modern era. This all explains the poor performance in Ukraine during the initial months of the war, coupled by outdated tactics and lack of precision weapons. But Russia has woken up to this and things are starting to change. The Su-34 has now got long overdue satellite-guided bombs with new laser and satellite-guided weaponry. But when I do say precision-guided weaponry, I'm not exactly talking about the same stuff that the Americans use. Even though the Russian GPS, called GLONASS, entered service in 1995, it pretty much was a heap of junk in the early 2000s and entered full operational service only in 2011, all while being less precise than GPS. Back in 2003, Russians were developing conversion kits for dumb bombs to use them as precision munitions, but there was no satellite network to support it. So it was only in 2023 that kits finally appeared in service in Ukraine to convert these weapons, and they've become a nightmare for Ukrainian defenders. So it looks like that the Su-34 may have actually got its weapons that it was designed for way back in the 1980s. Something that the Strike Eagle was able to do in 1999. But there is potentially a bright future for this aircraft. The Su-34M is the latest variant, with the main upgrade being the SITCH system. SITCH is comprised of 3 mission-specific containers, one being a powerful Pika-M radar being used for terrain scanning and detecting threats in almost 360 degrees, giving the Su-34 pretty much a unique capability in its class. The second container is an electronic warfare container, so the Su-34 can perform missions like the EA-18 Growler of the US Navy. And the third one is a recon container for drone or strike mission guidance, which we're seeing being more and more important in this day and age. And because the Su-34 is a real chunker with a massive payload capacity, it can also be a launch platform for up to 5 of the new Kh-69 stealth missiles, a single Kinzhal missile, or a massive Fab 3000, a 3-ton satellite-guided bomb that could blow away anything. Again, this platform gives it quite a unique capability. And don't get me wrong, the Su-34 is definitely a formidable aircraft nowadays, and a true workhorse like the F-15E. But, and there's always a but, in the era of stealth aircraft, can it really compare with its other counterparts from all over the world? Well, only time will show. In the meanwhile, the Hellduck, as crews like to call it due to its beak-looking nose, remains one of only 2 dedicated strike fighters in existence, and honestly, a truly cool looking aircraft. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.